Lara Burns, Head of Terrorism Research at George Washington University's Program on Extremism, and I'm here to continue telling the history of the Hamas terrorist organization, both in the United States and abroad, based on substantiated facts in an effort to provide truthful insight that hopefully cuts through the blankets of false information and terroristic rhetoric that is spreading through our country today. With me today is Senior Research Fellow Jennifer Baker. Hi, Jennifer.
Hi, Laura. So, Laura, when we ended our last episode, we were discussing how the U.S.-based Hamas infrastructure held a meeting in Philly in 1993 to plan how they were going to derail the Oslo peace accords and continue to support Hamas covertly in the U.S.
Yes, we spoke at length about that very important conspiratorial meeting, and we're going to continue that today. We've talked now at length about the organizations that were originally part of the U.S.-based Hamas infrastructure here, but as a reminder, we'll just go over them again. We've got the Holy Land Foundation, which was originally known as the Occupied Land Fund. That was a charitable fundraising arm. We've got the United Association for Studies and Research, the UASR, which was the political command/think tank here in the U.S. And then we had the Islamic Association for Palestine, the IAP, which was the Hamas propaganda front here in the United States. And we've looked at some of the festivals that the HLF and IAP held leading up to the signing of the Oslo Accords and this Philadelphia meeting, where they overtly expressed their allegiance to Hamas. But I wanted us to look because Mufid Abdul Qadir, an IAP band member and HLF fundraiser, who's also the half-brother of senior Hamas political leader Khalid Mashal, said it clearly. And then at the end of that skit, he pretends to kill the Jewish man, much to the pleasure of his audience. And if there was any question about their desire to kill Jewish people, this speaker in the video quotes a line from the Hamas charter that we saw in an earlier episode.
مثل المؤمنين في توادهم وتراحمهم كمثل الجسد الواحد إذا اشتكى منه عضو تداعى له سائر الجسد بالسهر والحمى فإن إخواننا وأخواتنا في فلسطين المسلمة يجاهدون في سبيل الله كي يطهروا أرضنا المقدسة من رجز أعداء الله اليهود ويلاقون في ذلك ما يلاقون من.
So that is an IAP banner on the podium there, I see.
Yes, that was an IAP HLF fundraising event. And at the end of the speech, the speaker recites a quote that we saw in the Hamas charter, and we talked about that in an earlier episode. And here it is. It says, the hour will not be established until the Muslims fight the Jews and the Muslims will kill them. To the point that the stones and the trees will say, O Muslim, O servant of Allah, there is a Jew behind me. Come and kill him.
So, and some of the leaders of the IAP attended the Philly meeting we spoke about last time. Is that right?
That's right.
So this was the meeting where the attendees vowed to derail the peace accords and support Hamas.
Yes. Several of the IAP leaders, including Omar Ahmad and Nahad Awad, were present and actually spoke at the meeting.
Okay, so speaking of these two people, we ended the last episode with the plan to create a new organization in Washington, D.C., one that would protect their interests, and we identify that group as CARE.
Yes, yes, we did, and we have seen Nahad Awad recently in the news where he received backlash for his comments about the October 7th, 2023 Hamas terror attack against Israel, where he said he was happy about those events. After a great deal of backlash, he claimed his statements were taken out of context, but let's look at it and see if his statement is actually consistent with the ideas expressed in this Philadelphia meeting.
The people of Gaza only decided to break the siege, the walls of the concentration camp, on October 7th. And yes, I was happy to see people breaking the siege and throwing down the shackles of their own land and walk free into their lands that they were not allowed to walk in. And yes, the people of Gaza have the right to self-defense, have the right to defend themselves. And yes, Israel as an occupying power does not have that right to self-defense.
And Nihad Hawad was formerly a leader of the Hamas propaganda arm, the IAP. He was an attendee at the Philly meeting where the attendees vowed to derail the peace accords, and who subsequently co-founded CARE, an organization that claims to hold no bias toward any group and opposes violence against anyone.
Yes, that is him. And that is what CARE claims on its own website, that it opposes violence against anyone.
Wow.
But I want to go back to the Philadelphia meeting because there is an important part of the meeting that we did not have time to talk about last time. It was their analysis of charitable and educational institutions in the West Bank and Gaza that were either part of Hamas social infrastructure or they weren't, and Hamas was seeking to take control over them.
That seems like a pretty important aspect, given that we know how significant Hamas's social infrastructure is to achieving its goal of winning the hearts and minds of the people and radicalizing them.
Yes, you are right. And on that note, let's just as a refresher remind our audience that Hamas used its social infrastructure to administer aid and provide services and education to the Palestinian population, but with a price. It was to secure their loyalty and support, which then bolstered their overall pursuit of the annihilation of Israel through violent jihad. We talked about how at the beginning of the first Intifada, this aid was going through organizations in Gaza that were led by Hamas founder Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. That was the Islamic complex, also can be translated to the Islamic Center. The Arabic term is Al-Mujama al-Islami. That was in Gaza, founded by Sheikh Yassin. There was also the Islamic Association of Gaza, also known as the Islamic Society of Gaza, and then the Islamic University of Gaza. And we talked about how they had also begun spreading the money to the West Bank in about 1991. And that's an interesting time frame because in that El Barase search warrant materials and all those documents we've been talking about, there was a 1991 fax to Shukr Abu Bakr, the executive director of the HLF, and it analyzed the charitable committees in the West Bank that were controlled by Hamas and which ones weren't, and actually talked about how many leaders they had and some of them and how many they didn't. For example, the Ramallah Zakat Committee was noted as, quote, all of it is ours. And then, they noted in one, they had 7 of 11 leadership positions. And then they said that the Jenin Zakat Committee was guaranteed by virtue of this man here, Mohammed Fouad Abu Zaid. He's a man identified as a Hamas leader. We'll discuss him later in the series. But notably, in 1991, they said they had no one in the Nablus Zakat Committee and only one in the Tulkarm Zakat Committee. And then it went on to talk about other organizations, including the Islamic Charitable Society of Hebron, which they labeled all of ours. The Islamic Charitable Society of Hebron, we will talk about a number of times in this series. It was a major charitable part of Hamas's charitable infrastructure in Hebron, which is in the West Bank.
Okay. But first, can you explain what the Zakat Committee, what is that?
Yeah, so very, very good question. And just to put it simply, Zakat is a mandatory obligation on Muslims to provide a certain percent of their income to charity. And so in this context, Zakat committees were those charitable institutions in the West Bank that were authorized to received zakat donations and then delivered zakat donations to the needy.
So, Laura, those would be very important to Hamas. If it sought to gain the hearts and minds of the people by getting credit for the charitable giving, how did they know so much about who controlled which organization?
Even in the 1993 meeting, the participants talk about the fact that everyone knew which parties people were associated with. They actually said the direction of the people inside is known, meaning it's obvious who is with Hamas versus Fatah versus the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. There was a general understanding of that. Everyone's direction is known. And in the meeting, Muin Shabib, a reported member of the Izzadin al-Qassam brigades, Hamas's military apparatus, or also called its military wing, he gave a briefing on which social services organizations belonged to Hamas and which needed more effort.
So here we saw another overlap between military operatives and the Hamas social infrastructure.
Yes, right? I mean, very interesting. So they've got a member of the military apparatus attending this conspiratorial meeting to discuss the organizations that are part of Hamas's social infrastructure. And he actually said they were going to discuss 10 different categories of organizations, the first of which was educational, such as kindergartens and schools. Another category was charitable organizations, like we've been referencing. Another was health institutions, sports clubs, and media organizations.
So did he mention specific entities?
Yes, he said, if we speak in general terms about our organizations in the Gaza sector, the main organization, which is known to belong to us, is the Islamic University of Gaza, one that we've talked about since the very beginning of this series. And we know that the HLF funded the Islamic University of Gaza in those early years. Not surprisingly, next on Muin Shabib's list of Gaza sector charitable organizations was the Islamic Complex, Sheikh Yassin's organization, and along with the Islamic Association of Gaza that we talked about just a minute ago, and the Al-Salah Society and several others. A side note here, just interestingly, kind of fast forwarding a little bit, in 1994, there were some allegations that the HLF was a Hamas front organization in the media, in American media. And Ibrahim al-Yazuri, one of the Hamas founders, wrote a letter on behalf of the Islamic Complex to the American media in defense of the HLF, demanding that the American media apologize to the HLF for calling them part of Hamas charitable or social infrastructure. He failed to admit on the letter that he was a co-founder of Hamas. So back to Muin Shabib in the Philadelphia meeting. He then moved on to the West Bank. So he moved from the Gaza to the West Bank. He begins to talk about the Nabal Zakat Committee. Now remember, that's the one in that 1991 letter to Shukri Abu Bakr that they didn't have any control over. Well, here they said they tie it to them, but in reality, their presence was weak. So it looked like they had made some progress, but not enough.
Okay. So I see where he talks a lot in this section about hospitals and medical centers in the West Bank. That's an interesting area for Hamas to seek involvement.
Yes, they wanted not only involvement, but control over medical institutions, charitable institutions, and educational institutions. And you'll note that Shabib identifies, which Zakat committees, interestingly, have medical centers, and then how they lament that their presence in some of them at that time was weak.
So, Laura, we've heard much debate about Hamas's use of hospitals in the news recently, specifically reporting after the October 7, 2023 terrorist attack during the war between Israel and Hamas. We've heard some disputed reports that Hamas was hiding in and below these hospitals. Is that surprising to you?
No, it is not surprising, because as we see, even back in the 1993 Philadelphia meeting, there was a concerted effort by this group to seek control over these hospitals and medical institutions. And we will talk again more about that later, but this was a purposeful part of their agenda.
It's very interesting.
For now, we will go back to Muin Shabib's analysis of the charitable organizations they had control over, and he spoke about the Ramallah Zakat Committee. I remember that's one in the 1991 letter to Shukri Abu Bakr that said they already had all of it. And just like they're here, they talk about how the Ramallah Zakat Committee is theirs. At the Philadelphia meeting, they talked about the great news, speaking of hospitals, that Ramallah Zakat was working on a hospital. But they said, unfortunately, the leader of the hospital was a doctor who was, quote, engaged in organizational activity. What that means is more overt Hamas affiliation with Hamas's military apparatus, and that he was arrested, this doctor, and that this interference brought about some crises for some of the organizations. So Shabib went on to talk about the Islamic Charitable Society of Hebron, a very important institution, and its Al-Alhi Hospital, and noted that they had some presence in the hospital and that God's willing, this organization will be ours at the end, particularly the hospital.
Particularly the hospital.
Yes, particularly the hospital. So they wanted a charitable organization, but more specifically the hospital. Their interest in owning and controlling hospitals in Gaza and the West Bank is longstanding. In fact, the HLF went on some years later, and we'll talk about this later, to operate its own hospital in the Palestinian territories. And Shabib, as they're talking about the woes and the troubles of the charitable organizations, lamented that another one of the society's leaders was deported to Maj el-Zahor. That was the 1992 deportation that we've talked about several times of the Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad leaders to Lebanon. And so he's complaining, oh, well, here, one of our leaders of our organizations got deported, and continued to complain that when the social infrastructure organizations were run by, quote, exposed people like Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, that it was causing problems for the social infrastructure. Because when they were arrested or deported, then the operations were messed up. That shows that overlap, right, of the different facets of the terrorist organization.
Okay, so over the years and beyond this meeting, the HLF sent money to these organizations.
Yes, to fund schools, hospitals, to aid martyrs' families, and provide financial assistance to the community at large.
Okay. And I think in the last episode, we also spoke about how the U.S.-based Hamas infrastructure, the HLF, the IAP, and the UASAR discussed education and how to cleanse it to prevent the children from getting the wrong ideas.
Yes, and we'll look at that excerpt again.
They recognized that a key part of their propaganda mission was to educate people in their community, particularly the children, to educate them on their extremist, radical, anti-Semitic ideology. And this applied to schools in the West Bank and Gaza, but also their intent to do it in schools here in the United States. They discussed that to make people and students aware of their messaging, quote, this will be done at universities and the school levels, end quote. And the speaker went on to say, quote, as for the young people's level, an educational material ought to be prepared to be taught in Islamic curricula. We don't want the children of the community who are raised here in schools and in Islamic schools and non-Islamic schools to grow up surrendering to the issue of peace with the Jews. And I mean, we don't see in 10 years the growing generations in America surrendering to peace with Jews. Therefore, there must be a curricula and teaching materials which spread in Islamic schools and weekend schools, end quote. That's what they want to teach the children. Further, Omar Ahmad, again of the IAP, talked about educating the educators because they needed teachers who could teach their radical ideology to the students. And they really wanted to strengthen, or Omar Ahmad wanted to strengthen the Islamist influence in American universities and reduce what they saw as Jewish influence in these universities. He said it was a catastrophe that people who join the U.S. government come out of these universities where there is little Islamist influence.
Okay, so I know we'll talk a lot about Hamas and the Hamas-run schools in this series, but do you think we can talk about it now briefly while we're on point about it and talk about what Hamas would do in these schools, in these Hamas-run schools?
Yes, and we will watch some videos of this activity in later episodes, but video footage of a number of Hamas-run schools shows children as young as 5 dressing like Hamas terrorists, carrying assault rifles, carrying rocket-propelled grenade launchers, conducting military-style training, wearing suicide vests, and stating that they support jihad and death for the sake of Allah. They also go around talking about their hatred towards the Jewish people.
That is crazy. I mean, that is so young for that type of activity.
Yes, you are very on point there. Just very young. Remember the last episode when we talked about the point of the Philadelphia meeting where the attendees complained over what might happen if the Palestinian state started and things settled down, and the group said, God forbid.
Yeah, that was very shocking.
Yes, but they, like Hamas, wanted the peace accords to fail. They wanted to undermine Arafat, and they intended to derail the accords. And so that's their theme.
But it seems like many Palestinians were supportive of the positive developments. So how could they do this? I mean, if the mainstream was so supportive of peace and the Palestinian self-rule, how did Hamas go about attempting to derail the accords?
With terrorism, violence, and murder. However, when they were planning all this, they were not certain how the Palestinian Authority was going to respond when they continued these terrorist activities. They questioned the possibility of the continuance of jihad operations against the Jews, a matter which the self-rule authority won't accept. So they knew the Palestinian Authority was not going to accept their continued jihad operations. And they even recognized that Israel and even the Americans were accustomed now to dealing with terrorist activity, but that the new Palestinian Authority had not been a victim of terrorism. And they weren't sure how the Palestinian Authority would actually respond to being a victim of terrorist activity. So after the Philadelphia meeting, and before we first see the emergence of CARE as an organization, as part of the U.S.-based Hamas infrastructure, an opportunity presented itself to Hamas, right? So you've got popular support in favor of these accords, and you ask, how did Hamas intend to derail it? So post-Philadelphia meeting, early 1994, a terrible thing happened, but what it did was it provided an opportunity to Hamas. Most of us would refer to this event as a devastating, murderous event, but it likely set the stage for Hamas to begin its very violent campaign. And what that event was, in February of 1994, so several months after the Philadelphia meeting, Baruch Goldstein, an extremist Jewish settler and member of Kahan Kai, entered the Al-Ibrahimi Mosque in Hebron, which is in the West Bank, as innocent worshipers gathered, and Goldstein murdered at least 40 of them before killing himself. It was a brutal act of terrorism. And notwithstanding that atrocity, though, Israel and the Palestinian Authority continued their commitment to the peace accord. But Hamas saw this as an opportunity, or a window of opportunity, an excuse to unleash a rabid, violent wave of attacks like they had not done before.
It was at lunchtime when the bomb went off, cutting down shoppers waiting at a bus stop in Afula town centre. It's believed that the bomber himself was among the 8 who died. The attack was timed to mark the end of the Islamic mourning period for the victims of the Hebron massacre. Whoever planned the bombing took plenty of casualties, at least 50 people injured, many of whom suffered lucky escapes from death.
I ran away, and I ran away. You see my clothes became burning, and in this moment I didn't remember what's happened, you know.
At Afula's hospital, they couldn't cope with the stream of casualties. Helicopters were used to ferry them to other places. Hamas, the hardline Palestinian group, claimed responsibility for the attack, which has touched off anti-Arab protests across Israel. Many people had predicted that this kind of attack would follow Hebron, and the Israeli government is already saying that it won't allow these latest deaths to deflect the peace process. Mark Urban, BBC News, Afula.
The brutal bombing attacks began in April 1994 with 2 attacks on back-to-back days. We located archived BBC coverage of the events, and we'll see some of that here.
And another Palestinian strikes at another Israeli bus stop. This time, a gunman who mowed down commuters with a submachine gun. One Israeli was killed and several wounded before the Palestinian was shot dead. It could have been much worse. Several full magazines and a knife were visible beside his gun. The survivors were taken to hospital, where normal life was brought to a halt by the siren marking Holocaust Day, a commemoration of those killed by the Nazis. Elsewhere, there were 2 stabbing attacks on Israelis. The hardline Palestinian group Hamas has promised more. At that same moment, the Israeli political elite were marking Holocaust Day with a wreath-laying ceremony. There have been few public statements about the Palestinian attacks, but privately Israeli ministers are known to be baffled and angered by the absence of any condemnation by Yasser Arafat of yesterday's bomb attack.
Even in those early news reports, we hear how these attacks are causing tension between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, as Hamas hoped.
In Afula, they buried those victims, including 3 schoolgirls and their teacher. It was bound to be a day of high emotion, and tempers flared when a deputy government minister paying his respects was attacked by mourners. Afterwards, those same feelings of anger with the government and its plans to make peace with the Palestinians were vented on the town's streets.
And another attack occurred several months later, but this time Hamas hit the thriving tourist hub of Tel Aviv.
Just before 9, at the height of Tel Aviv's rush hour, the bomb ripped apart a commuter bus. An amateur cameraman recorded the scene in the moments afterwards as a dazed woman was helped out of the smouldering wreckage. It had happened in Dizengoff Street, the city's commercial heart, and a place where people normally sit in cafes and relax. Today, though, the bloodied survivors and those in shock stumbled onto the pavement as passers-by came to their aid. Many were killed instantly, dozens injured. The scene bore witness to the force of the blast. Sections of the bus had been scattered around. Aya Kedar was woken by the explosion and rushed to her balcony.
I didn't want to believe that under my house there is a bomb. And when I realized it's a bomb, I started to cry because it was the first time I saw it in Tel Aviv.
The Islamic radical movement Hamas has claimed responsibility for the explosion, the latest in a series of attacks aimed at inflaming Israeli public opinion and derailing the peace process.
I was crying, I was very shocked, and I saw people running and nobody knew what to do, and passers-by were trying to help. They came to me and they said, sit down, and they brought me water and they tried to bathe me, and I said no because I had pieces of glass on me.
With so many injured, the supplies for transfusions began running low and people answered appeals to give blood. The Islamic group Hamas claimed responsibility for the deadliest terrorist attack in Israel for 16 years. Police combed the wreckage, trying to prove their hunch that the person who took so many lives was a suicide bomber. Often Hamas bombs have been crudely made, but this one went off with devastating force. Bits of the bus hung from power lines. Elsewhere, people gathered human remains, trying to bring some religious dignity to those whose lives had ended in a flash of high explosive. Israel's opposition leader linked the bombing to the Prime Minister's recent decision to lift restrictions on the movement of Palestinians.
Mr. Rabin chose to disregard my warning. He chose Arafat over the security of the people of Israel, and I think he must realize that he must change his policy immediately.
So I see what's happening there. Hamas attacks, and then the people on both sides begin blaming the peace process and Arafat. I think we saw something in the Philadelphia meeting about the U.S.-based infrastructure and wanting to undermine Arafat. Was that right?
Yes, that's exactly right. And that's what they're doing here, right? Hamas commits an attack, Israel retaliates, and then Hamas throws Yasser Arafat under the bus for his failures. And that's exactly what they talked about in the Philadelphia meeting, where the leader of the HLF, Sheikh Abu Bakr, and the leader of the IAP, Omar Ahmad, discussed the need to gradually take away confidence from the Palestinian Authority and derail the agreement. And so this was part of their plan.
So we saw CARE on the Palestinian Committee agenda in July 1994, and you said they were officially created a couple months after that.
That's right.
Okay. So while all this was going on is when it was created?
Yes. So Hamas began its brutal wave of suicide bombings, and The organizations in the United States just kept right on going. The HLF kept sending money. The IAP kept publishing its news, and the IAP leaders founded CARE.
Did Hamas continue its bombings?
Yes, it did.
So were these suicide bombings impacting the work of Hamas's charitable infrastructure?
Yes. With these suicide bombings, there were closures of organizations over there, but someone called and reported it to Mohammed El-Mazain, the chairman of the board of the HLF. But take a look at his thoughts on the matter. Ashkar, who we talked about before, spoke with El-Mazain about the reports that Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and his government were shutting down the charitable organizations. But El-Mazain said, and this is a quote, "They still threaten and making noise and stuff. I said, my man, it is okay. The name changes and the work continues as is. And if it did not come through point A, it will come through point B. And God knows all secrets." Let's take a look at one more Hamas suicide bombing in 1994 in an archive video we located from the Associated Press. And let me just say before this one begins that some of the images in this video are quite graphic for those who do not wish to view them.
The Islamic group Hamas took responsibility for the attack and said the intention was to kill Israeli Air Force personnel aboard the bus. But the driver reportedly closed the doors in the face of the assailant just in time. As the bus drew away, the bomb went off, killing the suicide bomber outright. The family of the bomb carrier, a 21-year-old resident of Khan Yunis in the Gaza Strip, was distraught. He'd served as a policeman in Gaza for several months. His family were unaware of his deadly mission. The incident was high on the agenda at the regular Israeli cabinet meeting. Israel remains committed to the peace process with the Palestinians, but it'll always fight back against terrorist attacks, as Economy Minister Shimon Shetrit made clear.
We are committed to maintain the peace process, at the same time to fight with all our might the terrorists.
Hamas had vowed on Friday to avenge the death in Jericho last week of one of its guerrillas, whom the group said was killed by Israeli undercover units. However, Palestinian police sources said Israel was not involved in that incident.
So this video seems to demonstrate that despite the violence and killing, as of the end of 94, the Israelis and the Palestinian Authority were still attempting to preserve their agreement. But you know what? Hamas was making progress in its campaign to derail it. Thank you all for joining us this time. Join us next for episode 5, A Beautiful Operation. We'll see you then.
Thank you. See you next time.
hey 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 ya أطفال الحجارة يلا